Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today, we're going to be talking about the Chyna biography on A&E. A tremendous piece of work. Even if you've seen the other Chyna biographies and you are kind of tired of this story, it still was very, very entertaining and worth watching. I got a lot out of it, even though, of course, we know most of the story. At least this is a story that we know how it ends. This, I feel, is a melding of the Vice documentary on Chyna with some of the other documentaries we've seen on Chyna, where you had Anthony Anzaldo, professional scumbag who was taking advantage of Chyna in her later part of her life. X-Pac was in it. Beth Phoenix was in it. Lita. Jerry the King Lawler. Mick Foley was substantial in this thing. Chyna's sister was all through here, and she was fantastic. Chyna's mother, even though her and Chyna didn't have much of a relationship, it was very interesting to have her mom involved with this. So because everybody knows the story, I'm not going to go through from the beginning to end, from Chyna's birth into her death, which is what the biography goes through. I'm instead going to point at certain pieces of the story and discuss how they discussed it in the A&E biography. So, of course, number one with the bullet, how did they handle the Triple H Stephanie relationship in Chyna? How did they handle that? Well, the documentary discussed Chyna and Triple H's relationship. Basically, they were bodybuilders. They did everything together. Chyna was dating some other guy, that Dan Blaze, who was also in the biography. But because she was traveling so much, their relationship kind of fell apart, and then she started dating Triple H. At this point, they're together. Of course, we know how the story goes. Lita discusses that Chyna finds the letter that Stephanie McMahon supposedly wrote Triple H in his bag. And this, of course, caused all sorts of problems. And from there, of course, Chyna and Triple H, they break up. Stephanie and Triple H go on forward. And this, of course, leads us to Chyna's exit from the WWE. So they discussed in the biography both theories, that Stephanie essentially forced Chyna out, and that Chyna left on her own free will after demanding X amount of dollars from WWE. Now, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, because we don't know what the truth actually is. And I know that there's going to be people who are going to point to interviews that Chyna did in her later years. I hate to be the person that has to say this, but Chyna is a drug addict, and she has severe mental health problems. And when you're a drug addict with severe mental health problems, you have a tendency to project. I work with people who have mental illness. I can tell you, they take the blame for absolutely nothing. Everything is somebody else's fault. They're always persecuted. And you can see bits of this in the later part of the biography, where Chyna clearly is showing symptoms of mental illness, where she's talking about a friend of hers basically taking advantage of her, that he just comes in and throws pictures at her, and she's like, "I'm Chyna, I'm a champion, you don't treat me like that." And she's just kind of going off on a tangent or whatever. So you have to understand, when she did those interviews, she was in and out of doing drugs. So she's not going to tell the exact truth, because part of telling the truth is being clean enough and clear enough in your thoughts and organizing your thoughts appropriately and being able to understand what actually occurred. Now, they did discuss that Stephanie did not force Chyna out. WWE did offer Chyna a renewal on her contract, but they didn't offer her the money that she wanted. Now, that makes sense. That happens literally all the time. That's very reasonable. Now, Chyna is, of course, in a unique situation due to the fact that the boss's daughter is dating a wrestler who is her ex-boyfriend. So then again, any situation that didn't turn out roses for Chyna was going to end up being, well, Chyna got screwed over because of Stephanie and Triple H. There's just no way. Unless they gave her more money than they gave anybody else and treated her, threw roses at her feet. And even if they did that, it probably still wouldn't be enough. in that situation, you can't do anything other than blame Triple H and Stephanie for how it happened, because we don't know how else it would have gone. We don't know that Chyna might not have wanted to work there anymore. Later in the biography, Mick Foley talks about Chyna essentially giving up on wrestling. That she could have gone to the independents and made a lot more money working independent. She could have she screwed up her own New Japan gigs with drugs and alcohol, and Rocky Romero was in the biography talking about that. So, you know, they didn't talk about TNA at all, but she actually did a TNA shot too around that time. So there were options for Chyna if she wanted to continue wrestling, but she didn't. They talked about her wanting to get into acting, and that her acting roles essentially stereotyped her as the giant wrestling woman, and they were mostly B movies that didn't go anywhere. And so even when she needed money, she didn't go back to wrestling. She would do things like The Surreal Life, and then she did the porno. So the question whether Chyna even wanted to continue being a wrestler, and maybe her love and passion for the business died because of Stephanie and Triple H, is entirely possible. It's entirely possible that, you know, that situation was so toxic and so ugly and so hurtful that she couldn't work there anymore and decided she didn't want to be in the business at all. But that's all just speculation. It's reasonable speculation, but it's all just speculation. So I think they handled it pretty fair. They said, Stephanie and the WWE, they offered Chyna to renew her contract because they did want her to stay around. But Chyna set the price at $1 million and wanted to be paid as much as The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin and all of these guys, when clearly she wasn't on that tier. Now, they did mention that she was, quote-unquote, de-pushed during this time. And this is where we kind of got, you know, an interesting perspective, let's say, from Road Dogg. Even though it's the company's perspective and it's really kind of, let's blow some smoke up everybody's ass, it's reasonable. It's not complete horseshit. So here's the position. Chyna is the first woman to ever compete in the King of the Ring tournament, first woman to ever win the Intercontinental Championship, first woman to compete in the Royal Rumble. She's wrestling for the title. They didn't talk about that, but she did have some title matches where she wrestled for the title. They restructured the entire business around Chyna, even in so much as they went from, as Shawn Michaels talked about in the biography, they went from finding ways to make the men vulnerable so that Chyna will believably get the upper hand on them. They went from that to Chyna standing flat-footed with guys and beating them up. So her character, you know, progressed from, she's a strong woman. If she hits you with a chair from behind, you're definitely going to feel it. We went from that to Chyna will forearm shiver you in the face and body slam you. That's character growth. So now everybody's saying, okay, Chyna's won the Intercontinental Championship. Naturally, you will want to keep going forward. Instead, in about 99-2000, around the time that Stephanie and Triple H kind of did their thing, Chyna was, quote-unquote, de-pushed to the women's division, where she became the women's champion, and all of her opponents are smaller than she is, and there's no good matches to be had with Chyna in the women's division. Now, Road Dogg, being the company guy, I'm pretty sure if you'd have asked him this question in 2004, he probably would have gave a different answer. But his response was they were trying to invest in the women's division. By putting Chyna back in the women's division, they were trying to invest in the women's division. And saying, you know, hey, what can you do? How far can you really go with Chyna wrestling men? Basically saying she crashed through all of these barriers, but this is still one barrier. You know, her wrestling flat-footed against The Rock and The Undertaker and Steve Austin, and maybe even being the world champion as a woman, that wasn't going to happen. So the best option was to make her the alpha female. She can't be the alpha male, but she can definitely be the alpha female, and had already been that by factor of being able to stand flat-footed with men and win matches. From my perspective, you know, because I'm a misogynist, I completely understand what Road Dogg is saying. You're going to have Chyna beat The Rock in a match. Not likely. You know, not Chyna wrestles The Rock and wins. Chyna wrestles The Rock or Stone Cold Steve Austin and wins. Chyna wrestles The Undertaker and wins. Not likely. Now, Mick Foley might have been the kind of nice guy who would have been okay with that. But most other guys with their egos and their insecurities and their misogyny, we're not going to do that. Now, most of these guys will refuse to do jobs to pretty much lower card guys as it was, period, anyway. Stone Cold Steve Austin didn't want to do jobs for guys who were sort of mid-cardy, and and he refused to work with them. I remember one of the things he said about Jeff Jarrett is that Jeff Jarrett worked too light. And, and Jeff Jarrett had volunteered to do a job for Chyna on his way out. Now, I wouldn't say he volunteered, considering he got paid $300,000 for it, but, and you know, that's a whole different debate. Let's not go down that road. So in any event, you're asking the boys, the top guys, now that you're going to work with Chyna one-on-one, she's going to go over, or heavens to Betsy, she gets in these matches and she continues to lose. Now, if you put her in that situation and she just keeps losing, then you take the shine off of Chyna and you put her in her place, technically. You know, she hits that glass ceiling, she can go no further. But there's no ceiling at all on where she can go in the women's division. You know, she can be the big monster that has to be overcome. But considering she was a babyface and that kind of stuff, even though she was kind of working heel against the women because they were no competition, they were so much smaller than she was, and she was having dominant victories. Is that a legitimate situation to discuss? Like, is it really a demotion? Well, if you're a misogynist, then yeah, it's a demotion because you see the women as not being as valuable as the men. And considering the women weren't as valuable as the men, it's an accurate point to make. It's an accurate point to make. She went from wrestling men to wrestling women. But she should have been wrestling women from the beginning. And that's the thing about when you start something and you just don't continue it. Now, is that Triple H or Stephanie's fault? Versus, is it that, you know, when Chyna's name comes up, these guys are kind of grumbling, like, look, I don't want to work with that girl. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't mind, you know, her hitting me in the nuts or her, you know, hitting me with a chair or something like that. But when you're talking about actually having a match, people are kind of like, I don't know about that. You know, a lot of guys are not for the intergender wrestling. And some of the guys, even today, are not for it. They're not interested in it. And that's why it's not really mainstream today, because not enough people are really interested in it. And it's not something that sponsors like very much. You know, they don't really like that kind of stuff. But I'll be willing to make the argument that Chyna's sudden shift to the women's division was inevitable, because there is only so much you can do with Chyna as a character in the men's division. She's an anomaly in so much as we have now been conditioned. And I was thinking about myself, you know, as a young man at the time. I'd have been 13, 14 when she debuted. I'd have been about 20 in 2000. No, I'd have been 16 in 2000. I can't even count. In any event, I did not ever think of Chyna as, why is this girl beating up this guy? Because Chyna was so big and so muscular. It's a completely different situation than if it was Lita or Trish Stratus or somebody like that, in which you could be like, yeah, she's a little girl, you know? Chyna wasn't a little girl, but she still was a girl, you know? And I can see why, okay, ultimately her place is in the women's division. Even though she's a shark in the women's division, her place is in the women's division. So I don't completely buy Road Dogg's explanation, however, because I don't think they were thinking that at the time. You know, I don't think Vince was sitting down saying, you know what, pal, we're going to invest in our women's division, pal. So we're going to put Chyna back in the women's division. I think it was mostly that they had gone everywhere they could go. There was nowhere else for her to go in terms of who else is she going to wrestle. She'd been in the ring with some of these guys already. She's already kind of lost to them. The position now is she going to start winning against some of these guys? And they're kind of like, we can't have Chyna, who is legitimately one of our bigger stars. She was top 5, to be fair. You know, Chyna was up there with Mankind and Rock and Undertaker and these guys as being one of the faces of the Attitude Era. She's one of the 5 people you think of when you think of the Attitude Era. You know, Chyna has to be on that list. And if she's not, I think that you have to be honest and just say you're a misogynist. No, I don't believe that. But I do think that she is one of the 5 people, when I think of the Attitude Era, I think of Chyna. So I'll say she's top 5 in the Attitude Era. But she's a woman. And none of the boys are going to work with her seriously and put her over. So you can forget about it. Even if she got better. You could even say, well, Chyna was a terrible wrestler. Even if that was the case, she still was a woman. And they still were not going to work with her. And you can call it misogyny or whatever. My thing is, if WWE really wanted to invest in their women's division back when Chyna was there were plenty of female wrestlers that she could have worked with. A lot of them were going to be smaller than she was. But there were some women with some legitimate wrestling backgrounds that they could have done stuff with. Ivory being one of them. They had her squash Ivory. Molly Holly is another one. I think they had her squash Molly Holly too. So the character of Chyna was entirely too powerful. You would have had to invest in other women wrestlers by going out and getting them and bringing them in. And I did not see that happening at the time. So I don't believe at all that they were investing in the women's division in WWE. I think they just didn't know what else to do with her. So they just threw her back in the women's division because, hey, at the very least, Chyna can look great. She can get over. She can get on the microphone. She can talk. If she can work, it's going to be very difficult for her to be a babyface because it's very difficult for her to get sympathy against the women. Because she's going to be so much bigger than everybody. But it was the best option that they can come up with. So I don't necessarily buy Road Dogg's argument that the company was trying to invest in their women's division. It was horseshit. Now, they talked about the porno, which is another interesting thing. I think Road Dogg, for his credit, nailed this one. Where he basically says you had 2 people, both of them are doing dope. You need twice the dope, therefore you need twice the money. And the only way they could think of getting that money was by doing the porno. So for those of you who don't know, maybe you didn't watch the biography or maybe you just don't know the story, Chyna and X-Pac, they had a sex tape that they sold. So they didn't go into Chyna's porn career. Now, that's 2 different things, okay? I want people... Now, they did lead up to it. They talked about during her backstory that Chyna was, quote-unquote, a cocktail waitress after she went to college. She was working in a nudie bar or something like that. And she told her sister that she was somebody special, like somebody in the office or something like that. She was the manager or something like that. And she wasn't one of the waitresses walking around topless or in a bikini or anything like that. But that was kind of a red flag. Then the second is the name Chyna. WWE pitched a bunch of names for her when she came in, and she picked the name Chyna because she knew a stripper by the name of Chyna back when she used to be a quote-unquote cocktail waitress. So that's red flag number 2. Number 3 is, Playboy. She jumped at the chance to do Playboy, and they told the story, and the angles were there. When she was a child, she loved attention. She liked to be the center of attention. But that becomes a negative when you're a gigantic mountain of muscle with a lisp and a protruding jaw, and therefore she goes and does all these surgeries and makes herself look great. Which I think was it Road Dogg who said, Paul, being Triple H, loved, or that was Shawn Michaels, who said that Paul, aka Shawn Michaels, loved her before she started having all these surgeries. Which I think is probably bullshit. I think at least the jaw surgery was probably a Triple H thing. Because, that jaw was pretty... She had a Sergeant Slaughter jaw. In any event, you see, if you follow the story, that Chyna had a history of kind of being in and around the sex industry. So her doing pornography. But they didn't go that far. They did talk about the sex tape that she made with X-Pac, but they didn't talk about the pornos that she did. The straight up porn movies. They kind of avoided that stuff. Why? I guess it's because you would see that it would fall into the same mode as the sex tape she did with X-Pac. And plus, a lot of people were not around her at the time when she did it. And I think you got to make some concessions. You're talking to her mom and her sister and all this kind of stuff. And her sister talked about how embarrassed and humiliated she felt when she saw Chyna had done the sex tape. So again, to get back in space, X-Pac and Chyna did a sex tape. Basically, they had sex on camera, and then they sold the tape to somebody. And they got a lot of money for it. It ended up being a lawsuit and all kinds of stuff going on after the fact. But they both did end up agreeing that they sold the tape. I think Chyna ended up saying at one point that she didn't agree to it. And she claimed that it was consensual and all this kind of stuff. I mean, that just goes back to what I was saying before about, when you're strung out or whatever, you don't always tell the truth. So it's pretty clear that she was pretty giddy to make the porno. And it was supposedly a leak, quote unquote. But it wasn't a leak because she went into the porn industry after that. They made a ton of money off the porno. And then, of course, it was distributed as DVDs and all that kind of stuff. Then she started doing, straight up pornography. She just went into the porn industry. But again, WWE showed some kind of decorum by not talking about her porno career. And they really didn't do much to denigrate Chyna at all, if we're being honest. And that's just being fair. But they talked about the initial porno with X-Pac. And X-Pac was talking about, they were initially hiding that they did drugs from one another. Because apparently Chyna did not do drugs while she was in WWE. That her drug use actually started happening after she left WWE. Which some people would say, okay, was a outcome of her broken heart. That she just needed something to deal with the pain. But it might have also been lingering injuries. It could have been recreational. It could have been pretty much anything from that point. They did show a little bit about her reality TV show appearances, like in The Surreal Life and the Celebrity Rehab, but they didn't go into any detail about that stuff. They didn't go into any detail at all, not much anyway, about the accusations of Chyna assaulting people. Basically, she did assault X-Pac, and then she also assaulted another friend of hers. But that's something that most people don't even know anything about. But she apparently beat up a female friend too. They spent they talked about her time in Japan. Not just her wrestling Masahiro Chono, but her teaching English in Japan. And it was a job that she really liked and she enjoyed it. But she was suicidal and she was on all kind of mental health drugs and stuff like that. And she actually assaulted a police officer in Japan. And she got arrested and got put in a mental asylum. And that's how she ended up losing her job in Japan. And that led her to the arms of Anthony Anzaldo, that absolute scumbag who would take advantage of her for the rest of her life. As a documentary goes, it was excellent. But we all know the story of Chyna inside and out. They still, like all the other Chyna documentaries, they are very respectful of her. They don't try to denigrate her too much. Even though they don't really need to attack Chyna and her credibility or anything like that, or counter any things that she said. They just kind of talk about go through the story. This is her life. This is the situation she found herself in. This is how she chose to handle it. And ultimately, they positioned her as a feminist icon. The first woman to do all of these great things in WWE, get labeled the ninth wonder of the world. She was beloved by everybody who ever met her, and she had a tragic end. That's basically how it's framed. Nothing lost in miscommunication, and nothing that came out of this thing that I felt was in any way disrespectful to Chyna or controversial. It was just the story, and it's very tragic. So, if you guys watched it, what did you think? I think it was fantastic. It was a mixture of some of the other Chyna biographies that I've seen. So I really enjoyed it. But what do you guys think? Let me know. Do all the YouTube things. Peace out.